Week 5 is officially underway, and it's my job to tell you guys who you should be starting and sitting at the wide receiver position. So today I'll be going through my top 30 wide receiver rankings in a tier list format, telling you who the wide receiver 1s are, wide receiver 2s are, wide receiver 3s are, and my 5 favorite deep flex plays like always every week. So if you guys enjoy, make sure you leave a like down below, comment your biggest start-sit decision, and of course subscribe to the channel. We're on the road to 40,000 subscribers. Appreciate you guys for that continued support. But without being said, let's get right into it. All right, before I get into the explicit rankings, we're going to go through the will they play tier, a tier that basically just goes through the guys who are questionable this week based off reports, trying to indicate whether they're going to play or not. So the general rule of thumb I have for guys in this tier is that we'd like to see at least one full practice prior to Sunday. So I'm recording this on Friday morning. If they practice today, if they practice tomorrow, if they're ready to play, I'm more than fine, inserting them in my lineup with full confidence. But the guys for this week are going to be Amon St. Brown, wide receiver of the Detroit Lions. Report just came out that he is expected to play in this game. He hasn't practiced all week formally, so I temper expectations a little bit. He's still a wide receiver 1 in my rankings, but he's a fringe top 5 guy for me any given week. But because of the issues that he's dealing with both his groin and abdominal area, I have a low-end wide receiver 1 expectation for him rather than the mid to high-end wide receiver 1 he typically would be. Jerry Jeudy, wide receiver of the Denver Broncos. He's been limited at practice on Wednesday, but he should be able to play according to reports for this week's game. Top 35-ish level expectation if he does suit up this week for the Denver Broncos. T. Higgins, wide receiver of the Cincinnati Bengals. He did suffer a rib fracture in last week's game. Typical timeline is about 2 weeks for recovery, so he will likely be out for this game. If you have T. Higgins, expect him to not be able to play this game and have alternative options. I'll be going through, again, some of my 5 favorite deep flex plays. So if you have T. Higgins, maybe you put one of those guys in your lineup. And then finally, the biggest name in fantasy football that has not played thus far, we got Cooper Kupp of the Los Angeles Rams. He returned to practice on Wednesday, and a report just came out that he is expected to suit up against the Philadelphia Eagles. If he does indeed suit up, if he is indeed ready to go, I have wide receiver 2 level expectations for him this week, simply because he hasn't played in a while. He's been dealing with the injuries. He's an older wide receiver. I'm baking in some risk there. But if he goes out this week, plays like prime Cooper Kupp against the Philadelphia Eagles, he will be back to being a high-end wide receiver 1 in my rankings. But next up on the docket, we go through the official bye week teams this week, being the Los Angeles Chargers, the Cleveland Browns, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and the Seattle Seahawks. The players on this list the players on these teams that would typically be on this list are as follows: Keenan Allen, Josh Palmer would probably be in the flex play area, Amari Cooper, Elijah Moore, Mike Evans, Chris Godwin, DK Metcalf, and Tyler Lockett. So if you roster any of those guys I just mentioned on your team, make sure you have an alternative option this week, as they are all on bye. But now we get into the official guys for this week, my official top 12 wide receivers. Starting off with my wide receivers 1 to 6, the first name I want to talk about is going to be Tyreek Hill, wide receiver of the Miami Dolphins, going up at home to play the New York Giants this week. The Miami offense has been absolutely unbelievable to start the year, and Tyreek Hill already has 2 30-plus point games under his belt in the first 4. Dolphins are applied for a slate-leading 29.75 points, and I have no reason to believe they won't hit that against a struggling Giants defense. Tyreek's getting 10 targets per game. His big play nature, of course, is always on display, and this Dolphins offense, sans that one letdown last week against a really good Buffalo defense, has looked unstoppable all year. So fire him up against the New York Giants. I'm sure you were going to anyways, but he is my wide receiver 1 overall this week, even over Justin Jefferson. Stephon Diggs, wide receiver of the Buffalo Bills, going to play the Jacksonville Jaguars in London this week. He is currently the wide receiver 3 in my rankings. The Diggs-Allen stack is also off to a flying start. The Bills wide receiver turning in about 24 PPR points per game in the first 4 to start this season. They look like they're on the same page. They look like that Diggs-Allen stack that we saw last season prior to Josh Allen suffering that injury to his elbow. Josh Allen's giving you MVP level play, 9 touchdowns in these first 4 games. They're implied for 27 points in London against Jacksonville, and the Bills offense has been on an absolute tear since that stinker they had in week 1 against the Jets. Lock him in. He's a top 5 wide receiver moving forward, and he's my wide receiver 3 overall on the slate. A.J. Brown, wide receiver of the Philadelphia Eagles, going up against the Los Angeles Rams, cracks in as my wide receiver 5 on the week, and he's quietly commanded 10-plus targets in 3 of the 4 games they've played this year for the Philadelphia Eagles, and he's going up against a Rams D where the Eagles are implied for 27.5 points. the third highest team total on the entire slate. He's currently the wide receiver 9 in points per game, but he's coming off a monster 38.5 point performance this past week against the Washington Commanders. The Rams are a bottom 3 defense in terms of pass DVOA against number 1 wide receivers, and I expect A.J. Brown to keep this hot streak going. Wide receiver 7 for me on the week is going to be the flip side of the matchup with Puka Nacua of the Los Angeles Rams going up against the Philadelphia Eagles, and he's been the offensive rookie so far this year. He has 501 receiving yards, is top 5 in the NFL in terms of receiving thus far, and is coming off yet another double-digit 20-plus PPR point performance this past week when it comes to Puka Nacua. Until I see how he operates with Kupp when Kupp comes back, which he is expected to this week, I don't really see any reason to drop him out of the wide receiver 1 ranks. He's been getting too many targets. He's been performing too well. Yes, I have no problem where if Cooper Kupp looks like his old self and Puka Nacua gets relegated to the clear-cut number 2 this week, dropping Puka Nacua to the wide receiver 2 ranks. But given his level of involvement so far, the risk level of Cooper Kupp being an older wide receiver coming off the injury, I have to give Puka Nacua the benefit of the doubt. He's looked too good to not be in the wide receiver 1 ranks for me, therefore being my wide receiver 7 overall on the week. Jamar Chase, wide receiver of the Cincinnati Bengals, goes on the road to play the Arizona Cardinals, and I'm downgrading Chase. He's a guy that I've had in my top 5 basically every single week this year. I'm downgrading him to a back-end wide receiver 1 in my rankings just based off how bad Joe Burrow looks right now. The calf is clearly bothering him. It takes away the ceiling of what we want from Chase for our fantasy teams, and he has to be in the wide receiver 1 area because he still gets too many targets to not be. But the explosive plays, the big-time touchdowns, the Burrow-Chase connection we've known of past simply hasn't been there this year, and I have to dock him accordingly. If Joe Burrow is not playing up to Joe Burrow level standard, Jamar Chase becomes a back-end wide receiver 1 rather than the elite league winner, top 3 or 4 overall wide receiver expected for him coming into the season. And finally, the other wide receiver I want to talk about in this range is Michael Pittman Jr., wide receiver of the Indianapolis Colts, going up against the Tennessee Titans this week. He's my wide receiver 13 this week, but with the questions surrounding Amon St. Brown, he cracks the locked-in starts list on this video. Double-digit targets in 3 of his 4 games this year, and now it plays against a division rival Titans defense that is the definition of a pass funnel. They are the easiest matchup on the matchup chart. They give up points to the wide receiver position, and Michael Pittman is next in line. With A-Rich playing well, Pittman's role as the clear alpha on this Colts offense, a very surprising Colts offense to start this season. I expect yet another high target day, and given the matchup, I expect him to take advantage of this Titans secondary. But you need to start these guys. Now we go on to my 13 to 30 area where we'll be spending some more time on them. And starting off with my high-end wide receiver 2s, I have the San Francisco 49ers teammates themselves, Brandon Ayuk at wide receiver 13 this week, and Deebo Samuel at wide receiver 17 this week, going up Sunday Night Football at home against my beloved Dallas Cowboys. Very tough matchup this week. Obviously, the Cowboys defense is very stingy against the pass, the number 1 overall matchup on the matchup chart. And while they lost Trayvon Diggs, the emergence of Deron Bland opposite of Stephon Gilmore keeps them as being a very tough matchup for opposing wide receivers. However, Brandon Ayuk has shown a superstar level ascension to start this year, and Deebo Samuel, as we know, is an absolute stud in his own right. Ayuk has been phenomenal. He's averaging over 20 points per game in the 3 games he's played this year, and he should be this team's number 1 moving forward, in my opinion. I just think at this current point, he is a better football player than Deebo Samuel, but that's not to take away from Deebo Samuel. I do think that Deebo Samuel is also a stud player, and while I'm a little bit worried about the rib and knee issues he's been dealing with all week, I expect with this high-profile game, potentially the number 1 seed on the line in the NFC, the 49ers know they have to beat the Cowboys know they have to beat the 49ers, I expect Deebo Samuel to be used in a big way in this game. Even if he's banged up, he's going to fight through injury. Shanahan needs him to be on his A game, and I think Deebo Samuel should be able to produce at a wide receiver 2 level against the Cowboys. It is a very tough matchup. Maybe both don't hit, but I expect one to hit in a big way this week. I mean, there's too good not to. The offensive scheme is too good for one of them not to have a big game this week, given the talent levels of these 2 players. Calvin Ridley, wide receiver of the Jacksonville Jaguars, cracks this list as my wide receiver 14. Again, plays the Buffalo Bills in London this week. He's been very bad these past few weeks. Straight up, no excuse. He has not looked like the same Calvin Ridley than I expected coming into the season. But in my opinion, he is still the most talented wide receiver on the team. And sooner rather than later, him and Trevor Lawrence will heat up. This Jaguars offense will heat up, and we should see them be on the same page. He's been annoying. I mean, I'm a Ridley truther. I want him to be playing well. And these last few weeks have definitely been annoying, like I've said. But I do think that there's a blow-up coming moving forward, and that Right now, I'm going to demote him to wide receiver 2 ranks, but if he has a big game, I have no problem moving him back up into the top 12 area. And if he keeps disappointing, he will be subject to moving down moving forward, but I just want to give him one more shot before I move him back down to the low-end wide receiver 2s, high-end wide receiver 3s area. Garrett Wilson, wide receiver of the New York Jets, cracks in as my wide receiver 15 this week, going on the road to play the Denver Broncos. And we saw Zach Wilson play the best game of his career on Sunday Night Football against the Chiefs last week. And now he has a prime opportunity to build off of it against the single worst defense in the NFL right now with the Denver Broncos. The same Denver Broncos that allowed 70 points to the Miami Dolphins just 2 weeks ago. The Wilson to Wilson connection saw Garrett command 14 targets last week against the Chiefs despite a tough matchup. And I think that this matchup is much more favorable than what he experienced last week against Kansas City. It's the second easiest matchup on the matchup chart. The quarterback is on an emotional high coming off his best game of his career. And I love the Jets this week in a upset spot against the Denver. Denver's currently the favorite team. I think the Jets are a much better team right now than the Denver Broncos, and I think this is one of the mistakes of the lines. I love the Jets this week. I love their offense to potentially explode against this Denver defense. Therefore, Garrett Wilson being a top 15 wide receiver in my rankings. Wide receiver 16 is Nico Collins of the Houston Texans, going on the road to play the Atlanta Falcons this week. And this is easily one of my biggest hits of the entire offseason. Putting Nico Collins on my sleepers video, 3 games of 9+ targets, 80+ receiving yards, over 20 PPR points per game through week 4 thus far. He's been a legit alpha #1 wide receiver, and CJ Stroud has been performing exceptionally well. The Falcons have been relatively stingy against wide receivers this year, but the volume Collins gets and the efficiency he's displayed, he's currently the #4 rated wide receiver on PFF right now in terms of grade. It's to the point where he's an every week wide receiver 2 for me moving forward. Until further notice, if he keeps playing like this, he may even be subject to raising in these rankings. I think wide receiver 2 is a fine spot for him now, but God, if he keeps commanding 9+ targets and showing the efficiency he has been, you might be looking at this guy as being a top 15 wide receiver moving forward. But now we move on to my start of the week, and it's going to be Christian Watson, wide receiver of the Green Bay Packers, going on the road to play the Las Vegas Raiders this week. He is my wide receiver 18 in my rankings, and with Christian Watson, he made his season debut on a pitch count this past Thursday night, but he still produced 25 receiving yards and a touchdown on the 4 targets he commanded, despite only playing on 46% of the Green Bay Packers snaps. Second week's return, I think the breakout's in store. If he gets that full snap alignment like I expect him to with the second week coming off the injury, I think he's going to establish himself as the clear-cut wide receiver 1 on this team. Romeo Doubs is really good. We'll get into him in a little bit. He's more of a back-end top 30 wide receiver for me, but I do still think that Jordan Love's #1 wide receiver will wind up being Christian Watson. He was too good at the tail end of last year. He was still good despite the limited snaps he saw last Thursday night. And I think, like I said, if he gets that full snap alignment, he can threaten for top 15 wide receiver status. But now we move on to the low-end wide receiver 2s. And I started off with 2 guys that played on Thursday Night Football, with Terry McLaurin, wide receiver of the Washington Commanders, coming in at 19. And obviously DJ Moore, the big blow-up week on Thursday night, coming at wide receiver 2 for that Thursday night game. As we know, the song and dance here, Terry McLaurin, 4 receptions, 49 yards, 8.9 fantasy points in that game on Thursday. DJ Moore is probably going to end up being the wide receiver 1 overall this week. 8 receptions, 230 yards, 3 touchdowns. He scored 49 PPR points. And when it comes to Terry McLaurin, in terms of what we could take away from this game, I have to lower him moving forward, man. He's simply not commanding the targets we're used to seeing, and he's much more volatile than that good week 3 game he had would indicate. I thought it'd be a turning page. Sam Howell looking better. This is the wide receiver 1 on the team. Maybe he would start commanding, 7, 8, 9+ targets per game. But that clearly didn't materialize. And until further notice, until we see him command more targets, he's more of a back-end volatile wide receiver 3 than the wide receiver 2 I had him in my rankings this week. So I'm going to take the L on that one. DJ Moore, on the other hand, went absolutely ballistic. I still had him higher than usual due to the matchup and due to how we played last week. But man, if Fields is going to be this much better like he has in the last 2 weeks, and if DJ Moore is going to command this amount of volume like he has these last 2 weeks, you could argue DJ Moore as being a top 15 wide receiver moving forward. And I understand I've laid the top 15 figure for a lot of guys already this video, but a lot of guys in this range have a ton of upside moving forward, and DJ Moore absolutely fits that billing. Wide receiver 20 is going to be Zay Flowers of the Baltimore Ravens, going on the road to play the Pittsburgh Steelers this week. He's been an absolute stud to start his career, 29 targets in his first 4 games, and while he had a down game this past week, I expect him to get back on track. The Steelers are the 4th easiest matchup on the matchup chart right now, and Flowers is this team's de facto wide receiver 1. He's a number 2 weapon behind Mark Andrews. Lamar's playing at an MVP level, and I think Zay Flowers will get back on track in a big way against Pittsburgh after that bad performance against the Cleveland Browns this past week. Wide receivers 21 and 23 for me, respectively, are Christian Kirk, wide receiver of the Jacksonville Jaguars against Buffalo and London, and Gabe Davis, wide receiver of the Buffalo Bills against the Jaguars in London. And to start off with Christian Kirk, he's been on an absolute tear in these last 3 games. He deserves this wide receiver 2 status for the time being. I still think Ridley will end up materializing to be that wide receiver 1. I think he's going to bounce back. But at the same time, I do think that Christian Kirk does deserve his flowers. He's been playing really well. I think there's a real possibility that if Ridley keeps underperforming and Kirk keeps playing the way he has been the last few weeks, that I can swap these Jaguars wide receivers. I mean, Kirk has commanded 32 targets in the last 3 games. He has a really high floor as a wide receiver 2. I'm just baking in the fact that I do think Ridley will bounce back, hence why he's more of a back-end wide receiver 2 rather than maybe the high-end wide receiver 2 he deserves to be at this current point. And then with Gabe Davis, it's really just a process play, and I get it. It is very volatile, especially if you're in like a full PPR league, but this is the perfect upside shot you need for your flex. This is the game environment we want for Gabe Davis. The Bills are applied for 27 points. Josh Allen has thrown 9 touchdowns in his first 4 games, like I mentioned when talking about Stephon Diggs. And while we know what Gabe Davis is, while the consistent targets will never be there for Gabe Davis, he has the opportunity to break a slate working down the field, scoring touchdowns, insulated to one of the best quarterbacks in the league and one of the best offenses in the NFL. And I think that Gabe Davis, like I said, is an every week, top 30 to 35 play based off the upside he presents. But given the matchup and the implied total for the Bills, I actually have him ranked inside my top 24 this week. But moving on to wide receiver 24 for me this week, and that's Marquise Brown, wide receiver of the Arizona Cardinals, going to play the Cincinnati Bengals at home this week. I've slept on Marquise all year, but this Cardinals offense is so much better than I anticipated coming to the year. Josh Dobbs looks legit. The offensive play calling has been stellar, and Marquise Brown himself has been a steady wide receiver 2 over the last 3 weeks, and I think the Cardinals have a real chance to upset the Bengals this week. Joe Burrow doesn't look like himself. Like I said, this Cardinals team is buzzing. They're playing some very, very good football, upsetting my Dallas Cowboys outright, hanging in tough against the San Francisco 49ers this past week. That I think they're going to win this game. And while I like Michael Wilson a lot, I think he's going to be, a steady top 35, top 40 wide receiver for me. At the same time, Marquise Brown is still the wide receiver 1 based on usage, and I think he should have another good game to his resume this week. But now we head on to the wide receiver 3s, and starting off with wide receivers 25 and 26, I'll talk about together. Jacoby Myers, wide receiver of the Las Vegas Raiders, going up against Green Bay Packers at home, and Romeo Doubs, wide receiver of the Green Bay Packers, going up against the Las Vegas Raiders on the road. And starting off with Jacoby Myers, not taking last week to heart. Myers had an off week, but Aiden O'Connell targeted Devontae Adams or Josh Jacobs on 24 of his 39 pass attempts. It was clear he was overwhelmed. He couldn't get through his progression, so he was either hitting his number 1 or he was checking down to his running back last week. And Jimmy Garoppolo is expected to be healthy for this game. I think Jacoby Myers is going to bounce back in a big way. In the 2 games that he played with Jimmy Garoppolo, he commanded 22 targets. And despite that stinker of a performance he had with Aiden O'Connell, he still averages 17 PPR points per game on the season, and he looks like a steady top 25 wide receiver any given week. So with Garoppolo's return, I expect him to bounce back in a big way. And for Romeo Doubs, this is just a guy that I don't know where to place in my rankings. Like on one hand, he's commanded 25 Jordan Love targets in the last 2 games. He's the wide receiver 18 on the season. He's been playing some absolutely phenomenal ball to start the year. But on the other hand, I think Christian Watson should get his full allotment of snaps, like I said, with my start of the week with Watson. And I think Watson will prove himself as this team's number 1. He was too good at the tail end of last year. He commanded targets despite the limited snaps he played on Thursday night. I think he is still going to be the clear-cut wide receiver 1. But that's not to take away from Doubs. Even if he's the wide receiver 2 on this team, Jordan Love's playing good enough ball to be able to support both of them getting their targets. I think Christian Watson's going to be the 1, but I think Romeo Doubs can still be an 8-9 target per game level wide receiver 2 on this team, being that possession, big-bodied wide receiver in the corps that they have right now. Wide receiver 27 for me is George Pickens of the Pittsburgh Steelers, going to play the Baltimore Ravens at home this week. And I understand George Pickens did have a bad game this past week against the Houston Texans, but Houston just really beat the Steelers in all three phases of the game this past week. They blew them out. They dominated them from their offensive perspective, defensive perspective, and the special teams perspective, hence the 30-6 scoreline that we saw. Pickens still commanded 7 targets in that game despite the lackluster stat line he saw. And the Ravens do pose a tough test given the matchup and the Steelers' implied total for this week. But Pickens has really stepped up to the plate as the wide receiver 1 of this team thus far. And before the Houston game, he had back-to-back good performances and commanded an alpha share of the targets. And I think he gets back on track this week. If you have George Pickens, expect him, high-end wide receiver 3 play, 7 to 10 targets in this game, and obviously the big play nature he represents will be on display this week, which it wasn't during last week's game against the Texans. But we go on to wide receiver 28, Adam Thielen of the Carolina Panthers, going on the road to play the Detroit Lions this week. And I never thought going into the season that I would have Adam Thielen as a top 30 wide receiver for me on any given week. But here we are, man. He is the clear-cut wide receiver 1 for the Panthers to start the season, and based on his level of play, I think going forward, he has to be considered a consistent wide receiver 3 option with the amount of targets he should see in this offense. The only real risk here is that the ceiling isn't very high. The Panthers' implied total will keep his ceiling down, but at the same time, his target involvement will keep his floor high. I think he is a safe play, wide receiver 3. Put him in your lineup. He'll get, 8 to 10 targets, 65 to 75 receiving yards, and maybe, 5 to 7 catches. He may not score a touchdown, but at the same time, given the bye weeks, not many wide receivers outside of this range have a higher floor than what Adam Thielen represents, hence why he's a top 30 wide receiver for me this week. Wide receiver 29 for me is Jordan Addison of the Minnesota Vikings, going to play the Kansas City Chiefs at home this week. And Jordan Addison, managers who started him last week, probably didn't enjoy the goose egg that he had, but I think he bounces back against the Chiefs this week. Prior to the goose egg, Addison commanded his most targets on the season the week before with 8 against the LA Chargers. And while the snaps were down this week, they were ascending each and every game between weeks 1 and 3 prior to that. And before last week's game, he scored double-digit fantasy points at each of his first 3 games as a pro. So fire up Jordan Addison. Again, a little bit risky because he had that goose egg last week and it isn't quite a full-time player quite yet. But with the use of 11 personnel in that Vikings offense, with the ascension that he saw in those first 3 weeks, I'm willing to put my eggs back in the Jordan Addison basket. And finally, wide receiver 30 is DeAndre Hopkins, wide receiver of the Tennessee Titans, going on the road to play the Indianapolis Colts this week. And Hopkins has played through a bad stretch in his last 3 games, but he is still the de facto #1 target on the Titans, and I expect him to get right against this soft Colts pass D that ranks as the 5th easiest matchup on the matchup chart. He wouldn't normally be a top 30 play given his current situation, but with the typical names we'd usually see up here on bye, he cracks in at 30 this week. I'm scared he's taking a step back as a player, but we'll find a lot more about Hopkins if he's not able to exploit this good matchup against the Colts on paper this week. If he doesn't have a good game, I'm officially panicking on Hopkins, but I expect him to bounce back against an Indianapolis defense that cannot stop the pass. But finally, wrapping up the video, we have my 5 deeper league flex plays, and starting off with Wan'Dale Robinson, wide receiver of the New York Giants. He was commanding targets when he was on the field this past week. Obviously, the Giants' offense got absolutely obliterated by the Seahawks pass rush by giving up 11 sacks. But this week against Miami, he's going to be in advantageous passing game scripts. They're going to need to score points if they want to hold up with Miami's offense. And I think Wan'Dale Robinson is the clear-cut wide receiver 1 on this Giants team. So he's like a top 45-ish level play. I like him. And if you can get him in your lineup, especially with the bye weeks at hand, I think he's a very fine flex play. Josh Downs, wide receiver of the Indianapolis Colts, going up against the Tennessee Titans. He is a clear-cut wide receiver 2 for the Colts. Very advantageous matchup, like I mentioned, for Michael Pittman. And Josh Downs has just looked really good to start his career, and I expect him to have another big game against this Titans secondary that is simply overmatched against these Colts pass catchers. Third is Michael Wilson, wide receiver of the Arizona Cardinals, going up against the Cincinnati Bengals. 2.48 yards per route run to start this year, and while I mentioned Marquise Brown is the wide receiver 1 based on usage, I think Michael Wilson can prove himself to be even bigger of a talent moving forward. He's a top 40-ish level play for me this week, but if he keeps playing the way he has been these last few weeks, I think there is a big ascension opportunity for Michael Wilson to potentially be a top 30 wide receiver moving forward. Fourth option is Rashee Rice, wide receiver of the Kansas City Chiefs, going on the road to play the Minnesota Vikings this week. He has been by far the most efficient of the Chiefs wide receivers to start this season, and despite limited snaps, he is the one that I have the most upside for in this core. Sky Moore has shown that he doesn't really have a lot of upside this year based off the yards per route run he's played on his snaps. We know Kadarius Toney is a big knucklehead, and realistically, Rashee Rice has been the best performing wide receiver on this team to start the year. All we need is the snap share to go up, and while it is a little bit risky putting him in your lineup, If you're starting him as your second flex in a deeper league, you're looking for the upside. If he does get those snaps up, I think he's the best wide receiver on this team, and he's got legitimate top 30 wide receiver upside if he does get the snaps that I think he can. And then finally closing it off is Tyler Boyd, wide receiver of the Cincinnati Bengals, going to play the Arizona Cardinals at home this week. Obviously, the big news, like I mentioned at the beginning of the video, is T. Higgins is dealing with a rib fracture. And we've seen in the past that when one of these Bengals pass catchers go down, the other two step up in a big way. It's a very consolidated target share. Tyler Boyd has shown that he could produce with Joe Burrow in the past, and we've seen his targets go up in the last 3 weeks compared to week 1 with the other wide receivers battling injury. I think this Tyler Boyd game, get right spot for him, and I do think that if you could sneak him in as a top 45-ish, top 50-ish level wide receiver play, he will pay off in a big way. But either way, if you guys enjoyed, make sure you leave a like down below. If you want access to all of these rankings on a week-to-week basis, as well as our rest of season rankings, there are one of two ways to access them right now. If you guys go on to Underdog Fantasy and use promo code FSC, they will match your deposit up to $100, and you will get access to both our rest of season rankings and our weekly rankings manifesto that is updated on a week-to-week basis. The other way, you guys can go over to flockfantasy.com and use promo code FSC for 30% off either the Flocker or the Mother Flocker packages on the site. Make sure you use promo code FSC. You will get access to both our rest of season rankings as well as our weekly rankings. But with that being said, peace out, enjoy your Friday, and good luck in your Week 5 matchups.